Welcome to this video where we're looking at making a science fiction helmet out of EVA foam. Now my brother's a musician, and if you've looked back through the videos on my YouTube channel you will have seen that I've done numerous music videos for him in the past. That's also extended to doing the album artwork for the CD whenever he releases a new album. So he's got a new album coming out and we needed a new cover image. Now the album's all about a dystopian science fiction future, so I thought it would be quite cool to have a kind of a mind control device in the form of a helmet that the oppressive government would put on its citizens to reprogram their brains. Well, that's the idea anyway, and I've seen some amazing pieces made by some cosplayers online out of EVA foam, so I've always wanted to have a go at it. Now there are plenty of EVA foam tutorials online, there are plenty of really talented people out there doing it, so do we really need another one? Well, this is as much a build log as it is a tutorial, and in any case they do have a unique selling point, and that's in that I've never done this before and I don't really know what I'm doing, so let's get started. Now the first thing to say is that I don't think this is actually EVA foam. What this is some craft foam that I've bought from a company called Polyprops. They had a promotion on offer which was 6 meters for about 20 quid, so I thought, well, why not, you know, I'm sure I'll find a use for it. So it's been sitting in my front room for a while now, sort of waiting to be used for something. Now I've seen a few online tutorials myself, so I know the basic properties of this. You can heat form it, you can shape it and cut it quite easily. Now I'm a regular attendee at the Asylum, which is a steampunk festival in Lincoln in the UK. I've posted a few videos about that previously. There are a number of talks at the event by makers, and I've given a few myself about various pieces that I've made for the event. One of the talks that I've attended was by a chap who uses EVA foam quite a lot, and he was talking about how to put things together and showing us some of the armour that he'd made with it. And once I'd been to the tutorial, it really did seem pretty easy and very accessible to have a go. You don't need particularly complicated tools to use this. I literally just use a craft knife, some hot glue and some paint. So it's very easy to start with. Now I know you can heat form this, so the first thing I decided to try was to heat some pieces of foam up with a heat gun, and then to just bend them around some pots and pans in the kitchen to see what sort of shapes I could make. Now, the problem I ran into straight away is that things like colanders and things have handles, so you can't get a sort of a smooth finish to them because the handle always gets in the way. Now, by pure accident, I remember that the light in the bathroom had exploded a few weeks previously, so I happened to have the light fitting from the bathroom just sitting about. As it happens, this handle is almost exactly the same size as my head, so it was actually a perfect thing to start forming pieces of foam over. Now it seemed to me that if you can heat form this stuff with a heat gun, then you could also heat it up by sticking it in the oven. So I set the oven to 100 degrees centigrade and just put a few pieces in the oven to heat them up and make them a bit more pliable. This actually worked quite well. I found that if you left it in the oven for a while, it actually became really floppy. I mean, much more than you could achieve with a heat gun. So that was quite useful for forming it over larger areas. Now what I instantly found was that if you're trying to form this stuff over a globe, you actually need more hands than you have. An additional pair of arms doing this would have been really useful. So I decided to have another go. I had another piece of foam that had been in the oven this whole time, so when I took it out it was actually really floppy. I mean, it sort of almost felt like a piece of rubber perhaps. But what I instantly found was that it was way too hot to actually touch. So what I've done here is to grab a tea towel and wrap it around the foam, just so I didn't burn my hands. However, there was actually a happy accident where the texture of the tea towel actually became impressed into the foam, which was quite cool because it sort of gave it quite a nice texture that almost looked like sort of beaten metal. Okay, and there we go. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Okay, maybe not, but as you can see this does fit my head almost exactly, so that's a good start. I didn't really have much of an idea as to how this was going to look. I knew I wanted to have a faceplate that would completely cover the face so that you couldn't see out of it, but beyond that I didn't really know how it was going to look, so a lot of this is really just trial and error, trying to find shapes that look cool and trying to come up with a design that sort of looks like a cohesive piece. As I mentioned, this is actually for my brother's album, so the piece actually needs to fit him. And as it happens, my brother has an unfeasibly large head. So what I'm doing is using some elastic so that the piece will stretch and will hopefully fit anyone with any head size. I'm using contact adhesive to stick the pieces together. I find that really works well. So with the headband in place, this is what I've come up with. So I'm sort of in the right track, but as you can see, it's still pretty plain. So I need to add a lot of detail to start sort of giving this some texture and bringing it to life a bit. Now, something that I saw in another tutorial is a way to add rivet holes into foam. And the way they do it is to simply zap the foam with the rotating Dremel bit. I found that creates quite a realistic impression. So with that simple technique, it was actually really easy to create some curved foam pieces that look like riveted metal panels. So the way I did this was to curve some foam over the bathroom light fitting that I was using previously. And as you can see, I'm scoring in some lines with a kitchen knife. And then I'm simply zapping the foam with the Dremel again to create some rivet impressions. So here's where I've got with the piece, and as you can see, I've added a few more pieces here. What I'm also doing is cutting out some templates from paper just to space out where the various pieces will fit on the mask. So as you can see, this piece is going to fit on top of the head here. And as you can see, I've also drawn out places where some of the pieces will sit on the sides. So here's one of my curved pieces, and you can see where that's going to sit on the side of the mask. So I need to make another piece for the top, so I'm going to do that by tracing out this template on some foam, forming it over the bathroom light fitting that I used previously, and then I'm just going to zap it again with the Dremel to create some rivet holes. So I'm also turning my attention to some of the details I'm going to add to the mask. And as you can see here, I've got a bunch of found objects. This is a Nixie tube, which is like an old style transistor, I think. I've got a variety of those. They're all blown, but I've got some really nice mechanical detail in them that look kind of cool. I've also got some metal cages here. These came from tea bag strainers. Also got some plastic bits. I think these came from flat pack furniture actually. I tend to keep any sort of interesting pieces that I find, because you never know when they're going to come in useful. I've also got some plastic conduit here, which has got that really nice ribbed effect to it, and it came with a bunch of connectors which sit on the end there, so they look quite cool, so I think they might be quite useful. And finally, work with chucking out a bunch of cabling, so I just basically nicked the entire reel, so I'm sure this will come in handy too. I wanted to create some curved air vents for the piece, and the way I've done this is to cut some pieces to size and bend them around a drinking glass, as you can see here. I'm also finishing these with some gauze that I'm cutting to size here, and I also need a plastic edging strip just to make it look like an actual manufactured piece. I think that's the difficulty with doing this type of prop, in that because it looks like it's supposed to be a manufactured piece, i.e. something that could have been produced in a factory, you have to have some quite smooth edges and some quite carefully cut shapes to sort of sell that illusion. So I'm just being very careful here when I cut out the plastic piece to make sure that it isn't too jagged. There's actually some smooth curves in there. So as you can see, I'm more or less in a position now where I'm happy with the final design, and I can now start thinking about painting the piece. So what I've done here is to break the piece down into its constituent parts, and as you can see I've glued on some lengths of foam here just to give me something to hold when I paint them. Now this is a bit of a punt on my part. I've never painted foam before, so I don't entirely know what I'm doing here. What I'm going to do is use this grey primer to spray these foam before I start painting. What I hope this is going to do is prime the foam, and I'm hoping that the primer will seep into the foam and seal it, as I know that obviously foam is porous, so if you don't seal it before you start painting you can find that the foam just starts soaking up your paint, and as well as wasting paint I've heard it can make it quite difficult to paint. But what I've done here is to mask off the main piece, and I'm just giving them a good coat of spray paint here, trying to apply it evenly. I'm being a little bit careful here because I've never done this before. I don't quite know how the primer is going to react with the foam. As you can see here, it seems okay. I was slightly worried that it wasn't drying, so I've been sort of checking it with my thumb every so often to see how it's getting on. I think it's going fine, so I think I can now proceed to paint the rest of the pieces as well. So I'm using Tamiya acrylic colours here, and what I'm doing first is to give everything a dark metallic base coat. I'm then going over it again with some lighter silvers, so this is basically the undercoat for the piece. What I'm then going to do is start painting on top of it. My thinking is kind of like, imagine this had come out of the factory and you've got all the metal pieces in front of you and you're charged with painting it. Now I suppose if you were in a factory you'd probably just spray paint it, but because I want to have that chipped, weathered look, I'm going to paint it by hand. And what I'm going to do is paint it in such a way that some of the edges and areas are worn so that the paint is chipped away. Now I'd assumed I'd be able to use the paint chipping technique that I've used on previous models for this piece. However, what I found was that the latex masking agent, which I've used quite successfully for super sculpey sculptures, actually sticks really well to the foam. So that meant that I couldn't use it as a mask, put some paint over it and then peel it away in the same way that I have previous pieces. So that was a little bit annoying because I've achieved some quite nice results with that previously, so I had to come up with an alternative. Now one way I have used previously is to put little pieces of masking tape over the piece to mask off certain areas and to create a chipped look. That didn't really work in this case, so what I ended up doing is simply attempting to paint it myself. And the way I did that was to use lots and lots of very tiny brush strokes to try and build up a random pattern on the piece. The advantage of using the latex method is because it creates quite nice random sharp edges which really do look quite genuinely like chipped paint. So replicating that by hand I thought would be quite difficult, but as it turned out I got some pretty decent results simply by painting random shapes on the edges as I went. So as you can see, I'm going over this in a light grey, which is kind of going to be an undercoat. I'm trying to paint in a sort of a jagged, scratched look. Once this is dry, I'm then going to go over it again. So the idea being that the paint has been scraped away. You can see the metal underneath, but you can also see the undercoat beneath the top layer of paint as well. So here's what I've come up with before the pieces are joined together, and I'm pretty pleased with this. I really think it actually looks like scratched and battered metal. I might have gone a little bit too extreme perhaps in some of the chipping here, but it's easy enough to roll back from. I can just paint over any areas that I think are a little bit too much. So that's looking pretty good. So the next step is to glue all this back together again and then add some further weathering on top of the paint. So you can imagine that while the piece has been battered and the paint's been scraped away, it will also have accumulated dirt and stains and that sort of stuff. So once I've got all this glued together, I'm going to use some oil washes and some various other darker paints to add a bit more weathering to it, just make it look a little bit more battered and beaten. So that's pretty much it for the cosmetics, and I've got to say I've been quite impressed with how easy it has been to work with the foam and just sort of shape it into the shapes that you need. It's also been pretty easy to paint as well. So one final detail that I want to take care of is that this mask is going to cover most of the wearer's face. Now I'm going to be taking some photograph from my brother's new album, and what I want is for the part of his face that is going to be visible, so basically his mouth, to be lit in some way. So what I want to do is put some lights into the mask so that they illuminate the lower half of the face, so when I take the photograph it's actually visible and not hidden in shadow. So what I've got here is some LED strips. Now this is something that you can buy from Amazon or various other websites for about £10 for about 5 meters, and they're really useful because they're already pre-soldered, and normally when I've bought LEDs in the past I've had to work out what resistors they needed and step the voltage down to the correct level, but because these come ready packaged with a power adapter and they're already wired up, they're actually really easy to use. What you can do is chop them into strips and then wire them up yourself to use the same power supply. Please ignore my dodgy wiring solution here. And as you can see, they're actually really bright, which is quite handy. So what I'm doing here is just gluing them into the inside of the mask, and they actually come with a bit of sticky back plastic on the back, so that's quite good just for holding them in place. But I've added a bit of hot glue as well, just to make sure they can't move. So here's our rather low-tech photo studio, which is otherwise known as Mum's front room. We don't need anything too elaborate for this, it's only a close-up, so a black backdrop and some natural light is all we really needed. Pretty pleased with the way this has come out. It's my first attempt at using foam to make anything, so I can see what all the fuss is about. It really is a really nice material to work with. One thing I will say is that I didn't go too much into finishing the paint, so a lot of people use PVA glue as a sort of a sealant over the paint. What I did find is once this had been used a little bit, that the paint had started flaking away in certain areas. It doesn't matter too much because the mask is all battered and worn anyway, but nevertheless, if you're thinking of making a costume or something that you're going to wear to a convention, it's definitely worth thinking about that. So check out some other tutorials. There are plenty of other people out there who actually know what they're doing. So that's it for me. Thanks very much for watching. I have received a few requests to do some videos about some of the visual effects that I've used in previous videos, so I used some 3D modelling software to create some of the backgrounds here. I had intended to keep this channel mostly about sculpture, but VFX is something that I sort of dabble in, so why not? So keep an eye out for some of those, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.